The air above the Meuse River in northeastern France was deceptively calm on a cold February morning in 1916, hanging heavy with a mist that seemed to swallow the horizon. Beneath this quiet, rolling landscape of deep forests and modest hills lay a network of forts and villages that had stood for centuries, largely undisturbed by the march of time. But in the German command posts miles away, a cold and calculated machine was finalizing a plan that would not only shatter this peace, but would fundamentally alter the course of human history. This was the beginning of the Battle of Verdun, a clash that would become the longest and one of the most devastating battles in the Great War, a conflict defined not by the noble pursuit of territory, but by the terrifying industrialization of death. The German strategy was as simple as it was horrifying. They did not aim to capture ground, but to bleed the French army white, to drain the life out of their enemy by forcing them to defend a sacred position to the very last man. The scale of the preparations was unprecedented. The German artillery massed in secret, a wall of steel stretching for miles, ready to unleash a fury the world had never seen. And as the clock ticked toward the first explosion, the world held its breath, unknowingly standing on the precipice of a new kind of warfare where human courage was measured against the cold mathematics of attrition. This is the story of Verdun, a battle where strategy met scale and where the historical impact would leave a scar on the French soul that remains to this day. To understand the enormity of what was about to happen, one must first look to the strategic minds that conceived it. Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff, was a man possessed by a grim realization. The war on the Western Front had bogged down into a stalemate of trenches that neither side seemed able to break. Falkenhayn believed that a breakthrough was impossible against the entrenched fortifications, and that the only way to victory was to inflict such massive casualties on the French that their nation would collapse. He identified the ancient fortress city of Verdun as the perfect psychological trigger. It was a symbol of French resistance, a city bristling with history and pride, located in a salient that jutted into the German lines, making it difficult to defend, but essential for the French to hold. Falkenhayn's infamous Christmas memo to the Kaiser outlined his chilling logic: to let the French bleed to death defending it. However, this strategy was cloaked in secrecy. The Germans moved thousands of heavy guns into the dense woods surrounding the forts, using camouflage and silence to hide the true extent of their buildup. They stockpiled millions of shells, constructing a logistical network that seemed impossible in the muddy, torn-up landscape of the front. On the other side, the French High Command, led by General Joseph Joffre, had grown complacent. They believed that the forts of Verdun, once the pride of the French defense system, were obsolete in the age of heavy artillery. They had stripped the forts of their guns and men, leaving them undermanned and vulnerable, a fatal misjudgment that would play directly into Falkenhayn's hands. The stage was set for a catastrophe, born from the clash of a ruthless German gamble and a fatal French underestimation. The morning of February 21st, 1916, began not with the charge of infantry, but with the roar of the earth itself. At 7:15 a.m., the German artillery opened fire in a bombardment of such intensity that it was heard 100 miles away. For 9 hours, 1,000,000 shells rained down on the French positions, a storm of steel and fire that erased forests, turned villages into dust, and pulverized the very earth itself. The German strategy of Trommelfeuer, or drum fire, was designed to disorient and terrify, creating a cacophony so loud that men lost their hearing and lost their minds. The landscape, once green and rolling, was transformed into a pockmarked nightmare of craters, splintered trees, and trenches filled with mud and blood. This was the scale of modern warfare brought to its terrifying zenith. No longer was war about the clash of armies. It was about the total obliteration of space. The French soldiers in the front lines were decimated. Many were buried alive in their dugouts. Others were pulverized by the constant concussion of explosions, while those who survived were shell-shocked into a daze. When the German infantry finally advanced through the smoke and dust, they were met by a ghostly silence, walking into a wasteland where nothing moved. The first few days saw the Germans make rapid gains, capturing the key defensive position of Fort Douaumont with shocking ease. A small group of German soldiers simply walked through an open door because the French garrison inside was so small and disorganized that they had and even locked the gate. It was a humiliation for France and a tactical victory for Germany, proving that Falkenhayn's strategy had initially worked to perfection. The fortress, thought to be impregnable, had fallen without a shot being fired in its defense. As the news of Douaumont capture reached Paris, the French response was driven by a fierce surge of national pride and desperation. The leadership of the defense was handed to General Philippe Pétain, a man who understood that this battle was no longer about tactical maneuvering, but about survival. Pétain arrived at Verdun and immediately issued the order that would define the French defense. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. He knew that to stop the German onslaught, he needed to maintain a relentless flow of men and supplies to the front. This logistical miracle became known as the Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way. It was a single narrow road connecting the city of Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, and along it, Pétain organized a non-stop convoy of trucks. Every 30 seconds, day and night, a truck rumbled up this road, bringing in fresh soldiers, ammunition, and food, and taking out the wounded and the dead. The scale of this operation was staggering. Over 3,000 trucks moved 90,000 men and 50,000 tons of supplies every week. The drivers, exhausted and often driving under headlights despite the risk of shelling, became the unsung heroes of the battle. Without this lifeline, Verdun would have fallen within weeks. Pétain also instituted a rotation system, throwing divisions into the meat grinder in rotation so that the entire French army would eventually share the burden of Verdun. This created a unique sense of unity among the troops, a shared destiny that bound the nation together in blood. The daily life of a soldier at Verdun became a hellish cycle of waiting and dying. They lived in muddy, rat-infested trenches that were constantly being shelled, surrounded by the stench of unburied bodies and the constant buzzing of flies. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had been cheerful and optimistic weeks ago were now reduced to hollow-eyed ghosts, staring blankly into the middle distance, their spirits broken by the relentless artillery. Yet they held. They held because they believed that if they retreated, the road to Paris would be open, and everything they loved would be lost. Imagine a battle so brutal, so relentless, that it became known as the Mincer. For 10 months in 1916, French and German armies were locked in a death struggle around the ancient fortress city of Verdun. This wasn't just a battle. It was a symbol, a meat grinder designed with a single horrifying purpose: to bleed an entire nation to death. Today, we're going deep into the hellscape of the Battle of Verdun, one of the longest, costliest, and most savage conflicts in human history. The year is 1916. The Western Front is a stalemate of trenches and barbed wire. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn devises a chilling strategy. He wouldn't try to break the French lines. Instead, he would attack a place the French could not, and would not ever give up: Verdun. A city steeped in French history and a cornerstone of their defensive line. Falkenhayn's plan, codenamed Operation Correct, or Judgment, was to lure the French army into a battle of attrition. He would use his massive superiority in heavy artillery to annihilate them. His goal was, in his own words, to bleed France white. On February 21, 1916, at 7:15 a.m., the judgment began. Over 1,200 German guns opened up in a 9-hour bombardment, firing over 1 million shells along a short 8-mile front. It was the most intense artillery barrage the world had ever seen. The ground convulsed, forests were obliterated, and French trenches simply ceased to exist. German stormtroopers, experts in infiltration tactics, advanced behind this rolling wall of fire, expecting little resistance. Initially, the German advance was terrifyingly successful. They captured key positions and pushed the French defenders back. A French high command was in disarray, with some even considering a strategic withdrawal. But one man's iron will change everything. General Philippe Pétain was given command of the Verdun sector. His famous order of the day echoed across the battlefield: Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. Pétain's first move was to organize the logistics. There was only one road into Verdun, a narrow lane that ran for 50 miles. This road would become legendary. It was named La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Day and night, a constant stream of 3,000 trucks ferried men, ammunition, and supplies into the furnace of Verdun. This logistical marvel kept the French army alive, allowing Pétain to rotate his divisions, ensuring no soldier had to endure the frontline hell for too long. It was a lifeline pumping blood into a body that was bleeding profusely. The fighting soon centered on a series of hills and forts that dominated the landscape, places whose names are now synonymous with horror. On the west bank of the Meuse River stood a ridge called Le Mort Homme, Dead Man's Hill. For months, French and German soldiers fought and died for every inch of this shattered, corpse-strewn ground. The constant shelling churned the earth so much that it became a lunar landscape of craters, mud, and unburied bodies. Soldiers huddled in shell holes, fighting off attacks, enduring bombardments, and slowly going mad from the constant stress and terror. Another focal point of the carnage was Fort Vaux. This was a modern fortress, but it was garrisoned by only a small contingent of French soldiers under Major Sylvain Eugene Raynal. On June 2nd, German troops managed to breach the fort's defenses, and the fighting went underground, into the dark, suffocating corridors. For 5 desperate days, the French defenders fought with rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers in a claustrophobic nightmare. They were completely cut off, running out of water and forced to drink their own urine. When the last carrier pigeon was sent out with a final desperate message, the garrison finally surrendered. Their German opponents were so impressed by their bravery that they allowed Major Raynal to keep his sword, a rare honor. By the summer of 1916, the German plan to bleed France white was backfiring. The Germans were bleeding just as badly. The battle had devolved into a meaningless, attritional slugfest. Then, on July 1st, a new sound was heard on the Western Front. Over 100 miles to the northwest, the British and French launched a massive offensive on the Somme. This new battle was a catastrophe in its own right, but it forced the Germans to divert troops and artillery away from Verdun. The pressure was finally easing. The turning point had come. With the German offensive stalled, the French saw their chance. Under the command of the aggressive General Robert Nivelle, who had taken over from Pétain, they prepared a counterstroke. Nivelle was an artillery specialist, and he planned to use new tactics. A creeping barrage where artillery fire would move just ahead of the advancing infantry, providing a protective curtain of explosions. On October 24, 1916, the French counteroffensive began. The effect was stunning. Using the creeping barrage to perfection, French Marines and infantry advanced, and in a matter of hours, retook the mighty Fort d'Allemont, a fortress the Germans had captured with ease back in February. The psychological impact was immense. In the following weeks, the French continued to push, retaking Fort Vaux and clawing back much of the ground they had lost over the brutal months of fighting. By December, the battle had effectively ended, with the front lines almost exactly where they had been 10 months earlier. The cost was astronomical. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. In 10 months, on a battlefield just a few square miles, there were over 700,000 casualties. More than 300,000 men were killed. On average, that's 70,000 casualties a month, over 2,300 every single day. The landscape was forever scarred. 9 villages were completely destroyed, wiped from the map, never to be rebuilt. The ground is still contaminated with unexploded shells, and the soil is so saturated with human remains that it's considered sacred ground. So, what is the legacy of Verdun? For France, it became a sacred symbol of national sacrifice and resilience. The cry of, "They shall not pass," entered the national consciousness. Pétain became the Lion of Verdun, a national hero, though his reputation would later be tarnished by his collaboration in World War II. For Germany, it was a catastrophic failure, a battle that bled its own army just as much as the enemy, and exposed the fatal flaws in its high command as strategy. The enduring lesson of Verdun is the sheer industrialized futility of modern warfare. It was a battle where human lives were spent like currency for tiny patches of obliterated earth. It stands as a terrifying monument to the horrors of attrition, a warning against the hubris of commanders who see soldiers not as men, but as numbers in a grim calculation. When we look back at Verdun, we don't just see a battle. We see the very definition of a Pyrrhic victory, a struggle where, in the end, no one truly won, and humanity profoundly lost. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If you found this account meaningful, please like this video, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and hit the notification bell. We'll see you next time.